The room had no windows and no warmth. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a flat white glow across navy gray walls and a single metal table bolted to the floor. 3 cameras watched from the corners, their red lights blinking in slow, patient rhythm, recording everything, every breath, every pause. Staff Sergeant Mara Vale sat alone at that table. Her hands were flat against the cold steel. Fingers relaxed, posture straight but not stiff. She did not shift. She did not fidget. Her face gave nothing away. Around her, senior officers filled the room in polished uniforms, arms crossed, back straight, expressions already decided. This was not a place built for listening. It was built for judgment. Lieutenant General Harold Vance leaned forward in his chair, elbows resting comfortably on the desk. He looked at her file, then at her face, and smiled like he was sharing a joke meant for the room, not for her. "So," he said lightly, voice carrying, "let's talk about your kill count." A few officers laughed, not loudly. Just enough. Then the sound faded. Mara did not blink. She did not straighten. She did not lower her gaze. She stayed exactly where she was. Silent, steady, unmoved. And in that silence, the room began to feel smaller, tighter, like it was waiting for something it wasn't ready to hear. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Staff Sergeant Mara Vale was in her early 30s and she looked like the kind of Marine most people would never notice in a crowd. Medium height, lean build, hair pulled tight and simple, sleeves pressed, boots clean, expression neutral. If you passed her in a hallway, you might assume she worked logistics supply or some quiet office no one thanked. Her rank sat on her collar without decoration, no loud ribbons, no chest full of color, nothing that told the room what she had done or what she had survived. That was the first reason they doubted her. The second reason was her file. On paper, Mara Vale was a puzzle with missing pieces on purpose. A handful of training blocks, a few deployments listed only as general regions, citations written like they were afraid of their own details, paragraphs blacked out. Entire pages stamped and reduced to a single line that meant nothing to anyone without the right access. There were gaps that looked like mistakes. There were months where her unit was listed, but her duties were not. There were commendations with no story behind them and reprimands that felt oddly clean, like they had been laundered through too many hands before landing on the desk. To the people in that room, it didn't look like secrecy. It looked like favoritism. Some assumed she had family in high places. Others assumed she was protected because someone owed someone else a favor. A few simply decided she was a problem that had slipped through the cracks. And today was the day the system would correct itself. Mara could feel those assumptions without anyone saying them out loud. You learn to read a room in the Marines the same way you learn to read weather. You don't wait for thunder. You watch the small changes in the air. She watched the way the colonels avoided meeting her eyes. She watched the way a Navy legal officer held her pen like a weapon, ready to write her into a corner. She watched the way even the junior people in the room copied the posture of their seniors as if judgment was contagious. And through it all, she kept her breathing steady. In for 4, hold. Out for 6. Slow enough to keep the pulse down, quiet enough that no one could hear it. Her gaze stayed level, not because she was fearless, but because she had learned what eye contact can do in places like this. Too little and they call you weak. Too much and they call you defiant. So she gave them the exact amount they deserved and no more. Her hands didn't move. Not because her body was calm, but because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing tension. Years earlier, in a different room with different lights, a senior instructor had once told her almost kindly that the hardest part of service wasn't the mud or the miles. It was learning how to stand still when your name was being turned into a story you didn't recognize. Mara remembered that line now like a steady hand on her shoulder. She had enlisted young the way a lot of Marines did, with more grit than direction and more stubbornness than fear. She came from a place where people didn't talk much about their feelings, where they measured worth by what you could carry without complaining. Her early years were simple in the way hard things can be simple. Long days, short sleep, the constant pressure to earn your place without asking for it. She learned quickly that respect in the Marines isn't granted by your intentions. It's granted by your consistency. There were faces from those years that still lived in the back of her mind. A drill instructor who never raised his voice but could silence a bay with a look. A teammate who taught her how to check a strap twice, not because she was nervous, but because lives depend on small habits done the same way every time. Those memories came and went like distant radio traffic. She did not let them rise to the surface. Not here, because her current assignment was the part of her life she could not explain. The words in her orders sounded harmless enough if you didn't know how to read between them. Liaison, joint coordination, temporary attachment, support role, a list of polite phrases that made her sound like a clerk walking between offices. But she wasn't there to file paperwork. She was there because she had been trusted quietly with things the public would never hear and some leaders would never admit. That trust was also a cage. Her operational history had been folded into classified channels and buried under clearance walls so thick that even senior ranks bounced off them. The more important her work became, the less she was allowed to say about it. The more she cared, the less she could prove, and that was the cruel math of it. In a system that loves medals and reports, she had been ordered to live as a blank page. So when people stared at her uniform and saw nothing, that was not an accident. It was policy. When they looked at her record and sword actions, that was not confusion. It was design. When Lieutenant General Harold Vance smiled like her silence was weakness, he wasn't just mocking her. He was mocking the very kind of service he claimed to lead. The kind that disappears on command and stays gone. Mara did not defend herself because she could not. One wrong sentence could violate orders that were not written in the same ink as the rest of her file. She could feel the boundary line in her mind like a tripwire. Say too little and they bury you. Say too much and they destroy you. That was why she stayed quiet, not from fear, but from discipline. And discipline can feel lonely in a room full of people. There was a moment earlier before the hearing began when a junior officer had walked past her table and set down a paper cup of water. The officer didn't say anything. No smile, no apology, just a small act that felt almost out of place in a room built to harden people. Mara hadn't touched the water. Not yet. She could feel the isolation in the way the room held its distance. They didn't hate her the way a crowd hates. They dismissed her the way institutions dismiss cleanly and efficiently, like a document stamped and filed away. Open hostility would have been easier. At least hostility admits you matter. This was something colder. This was a room full of accomplished men and women deciding without effort that she was not worth understanding. And still she sat there, hands flat on the steel, breathing slow, eyes steady, carrying the weight of what she could not say. Because sometimes the heaviest burden in uniform isn't what you did, it's the fact that you did it. And you're never allowed to explain why. Lieutenant General Harold Vance did not raise his voice when he resumed. He didn't need to. The room already belonged to him, and he knew it. He leaned back slightly, fingers laced, eyes moving over Mara like she was a problem he intended to solve in public. "Let's talk about your deployments," he said, tone calm, almost conversational. "Because on paper, they don't make much sense." He lifted her file again, tapping it lightly with one finger. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Same regions, different units, overlapping dates, assignments that start without explanation and end without closure. He looked up. "That's unusual, Staff Sergeant, even for joint work." Mara kept her eyes forward. Her breathing stayed slow, measured, practiced. "In for 4, hold out for 6. Vance continued. "South Pacific. Persian Gulf, Northern Arabian Sea." He smiled faintly. "You seem to get around." A few people shifted in their chairs. A colonel cleared his throat. Someone at the far end of the table scribbled a note. "Now," Vance said, "I'm sure there's a reason, there always is." He tilted his head. "Care to explain why your record reads like a travel itinerary with the details conveniently missing?" The question hung there, waiting to be answered. Mara did not move. Her jaw tightened just enough that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't trained to see strain in millimeters. Her hands stayed flat on the table, fingertips lightly touching the edge, nails trimmed short, steady. "I'm not authorized to discuss specific operations," she said evenly. Her voice was quiet, not weak. Just contained. Vance nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer. "Of course you aren't." He let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "That seems to be your favorite phrase." A few smiles appeared around the room. "Here's the problem," he went on. "We're not talking about classified targets or sensitive methods. We're talking about basic accountability, who you worked with, what your function was, whether you were even necessary." Necessary. The word landed harder than the others. Mara swallowed once. Controlled. Silent. Vance leaned forward again. "Joint operations require transparency at some level, especially when a Marine ends up attached to Navy units without a clear role." He paused. Unless, of course, there was no role. The room shifted. Curiosity thinned into something sharper. A Navy captain glanced toward another officer, eyebrows raised. A Marine colonel crossed his arms tighter. Pens stopped moving. "Were you embedded?" Vance asked. "Were you simply along for the ride?" Mara felt the pressure rise behind her eyes, not from anger, but from restraint. The words were there. They always were. She knew exactly how to dismantle his assumptions point by point. She also knew she was not allowed to. "I fulfill the duties assigned to me," she said. "That's not an answer," Vance replied lightly. "That's a dodge." A few chuckles followed. Not loud. Just enough. He let the laughter breathe, then pressed again. "Let's try a different angle. Your evaluations?" He flipped another page marked competent, reliable, calm under pressure. He glanced up. No negatives, no standout remarks. Very safe language. Safe, another word meant to shrink her. "In my experience," he said, "that usually means one of two things. Either you never did anything worth writing about, or someone made sure nothing specific ever got written." He smiled again. "Which do you think it is?" Mara's eyes did not leave the space just beyond his shoulder. She could feel the room watching her now, waiting for a crack, waiting for frustration, waiting for defense. Her breath stayed even. "I followed orders," she said. Vance spread his hands. "And there it is." He looked around the room, always the same answer. This time the laughter was more confident. The hearing moved on like that, question after question, each one framed to make her silence look like guilt. He asked about units she could not name, about missions she could not confirm, about time frames she was ordered to treat as non-existent. Every time she answered carefully, minimally within the narrow lane she was allowed. Every time Vance reframed it. "She doesn't remember. She can't clarify. She won't explain." By the time he called for a short recess, the mood in the room had shifted completely. Outside the chamber, the hallway filled with low voices. Conversations overlapped, sharp and speculative. "I don't get it," someone said. "If she did something worth hiding, why put her here at all? Looks like someone pushed her through. Probably political." Mara sat alone on the bench near the wall, back straight, eyes down. She didn't drink the water that had been offered earlier. Her fingers curled briefly against her palm, then relaxed again. In that quiet moment, the strain showed in small ways. A tightness at the corner of her mouth. A slow exhale held just a fraction too long. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have defended yourself or stayed silent? When they returned to the room, Vance didn't waste time. "Let's address the elephant in the room," he said, voice carrying your attachment to a Navy task unit during your last deployment. Mara felt the air change, that line, that subject, the boundary she could not cross. "According to this," he continued, "you were present during direct action operations." He looked at her, combat adjacent at minimum. She said nothing. Vance's smile widened, which brings us back to my earlier question. A few people leaned forward now. "In environments like that," he said, "everyone contributes in some way. Everyone carries weight." He paused. "So, it's fair to ask what yours was." Mara's chest rose and fell. "You're asking me to discuss classified material," she said. "I'm asking you to account for yourself," Vance replied. "There's a difference." He stood this time slowly, deliberately, walking a step closer to her table, not into her space, just close enough to be felt. "Silence," he said, "can mean many things. Discipline, loyalty," he tilted his head, "or it can mean there's nothing there." The room was completely still. Mara could feel the edge now, the place where restraint starts to cost more than it protects. She knew Vance was steering toward one outcome: force her to speak or make her look empty. Her jaw tightened again. She breathed through it. Vance glanced around the room, then back at her. "You understand how this looks, don't you, Staff Sergeant?" She nodded once. A small movement. "And you're still choosing not to clarify?" "Yes, sir." That single word echoed. Vance straightened, satisfaction flickering across his face. "Very well." He turned back to the panel. "Then let the record reflect that the subject has declined multiple opportunities to explain discrepancies in her service." Pen scratched, he clicked. Mara stared at the tabletop. The cold steel felt steadier than the air around her. She knew what was coming next. She had known from the moment she sat down. The questions were narrowing. The room was closing in. And soon, very soon, someone would try to break the silence by force. Something in the room had begun to drift out of alignment. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of shift you only feel after you've spent years around danger that doesn't announce itself. A pressure change, a silence that lasts a beat too long. Rear Admiral Thomas Keene had not spoken once since the hearing began. He sat 2 seats down from the presiding table, posture rigid, hands folded, eyes forward. To anyone watching casually, he looked like another senior officer observing a procedural matter. But as General Vance pressed forward, Keene's stillness changed. When Mara declined again to clarify her role, Keene's gaze lifted from the table for the first time, not toward her, toward the file in Vance's hand. His jaw set slightly, the muscle near his ear tightening and releasing once, controlled but unmistakable. It was the look of a man who recognized a boundary being tested by someone who did not know it existed. Vance continued, unaware or unconcerned. "You were present during maritime interdiction activity," he said, scanning the page. "That's the language here." A legal officer murmured something under their breath. Another officer leaned closer to read. Mara said nothing. Keene's fingers flexed once, then folded again. The words being used were careful, deliberately vague. But every so often, something sharper slipped through, a phrase not meant for rooms like this. A term that belonged somewhere else. At one point, a junior staff member leaned toward a colonel and whispered a reference to night insertion protocols. Not loudly, just enough. The colonel stiffened. His eyes flicked toward Keene, then away. Mara felt the shift before she saw it. The way a few officers stopped leaning back and started leaning forward. The way Pence paused mid-stroke. The way skepticism gave way to something closer to uncertainty. Her calm, which had been dismissed as passivity, began to feel wrong to them. People who are empty crack under pressure. They ramble. They argue. They over-explain. They reach for sympathy or anger or anything that might move the moment. Mara did none of that. She sat as she had from the start. Shoulders square, chin level, breathing slow. Her eyes did not dart. Her hands did not tremble. Even as the question sharpened, her composure stayed exact, almost surgical. That kind of control unsettles people. Vance asked again about timelines, about command relationships, about why a Marine would be attached to a Navy element with no publicly listed task. He smiled while he did it, but the smile was starting to look thin. Mara answered when required. Brief, precise, no extra words. When she did not answer, she made no apology for it. Keene watched her closely now, not with curiosity, with assessment. There was a moment when Vance referenced a training pipeline that did not exist in any unclassified system. It was a throwaway line meant to sound impressive, not specific. Keene's head turned an inch. The Navy captain beside him noticed and froze. A legal aide frowned at the table, then slowly closed the folder as if unsure it should be open at all. The room felt unsettled, but no one could explain why. It wasn't fear yet. It was confusion. Mara could feel their attentions shifting not toward what she was saying, but toward what she wasn't, toward the gaps that no longer felt like incompetence, but like walls. Her silence began to feel less like avoidance and more like containment. At one point, Vance paused mid-sentence as if expecting her to interrupt. She didn't. The pause stretched. He cleared his throat and continued. Keen adjusted his posture, sitting straighter. His hands separated and rested on the arms of his chair, palms down, a stance more suited to a bridge than a courtroom. A junior officer near the back glanced toward the door, then back to the panel, unease creeping across their face. No one said it out loud, but the question was forming in the room. What if she wasn't refusing to speak because she had nothing to say? What if she was refusing because saying it would change who had the right to ask? Vance felt it too, though he didn't yet understand it. His humor grew sharper, his questions narrower, his patience thinner. He pressed harder, leaning closer, trying to draw something out of her. Mara's calm did not crack. It sharpened. She met his gaze briefly now, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, as if to say she understood exactly what he was trying to do, and exactly why she could not let him succeed. Keen exhaled slowly through his nose. The room was quiet in a new way now, not bored, not amused, watchful. Whatever this was, it was no longer just about a Marine with a thin file. Something important was being brushed against, and the people in that